Progress Bar Analytics, better results with better data. Today, we're going to be looking at Microsoft's Power BI, tracking distance and zone 5 for heart rate as a key performance indicator. I made a performance indicator for my daily mileage, aiming to do a minimum of 5K a day, as well as looking at my heart rate zones, trying to keep my zone 5 to a minimum. On the right hand side, I have some stacked columns looking at my daily performance in terms of number of minutes in each zone. My goal with all of this data is to implement the secret that I've learned recently about sustainable cardio, managing heart rate with a heart rate monitor. At 38 years old, my heart rate zones calculate like this. They end up being a percentage of my maximum heart rate, which is at my age 167 plus. What ends up happening is that I have aerobic zones between 111 beats per minute and 166 beats per minute, which means that between those zones, I can keep up with my energy production. Going above it is the anaerobic zone, where I get sore really fast, I get exhausted really fast, and I can't keep up with the energy production leans, meaning that I burn out fast. On day one, my main goal was to run a 5K without stopping. I thought I was doing myself a favor by running at a slightly slower than 9 minutes and 10 seconds per mile. But as you can plainly see, my heart rate kept escalating until I was in the red zone at the end of my run. What ended up happening over here was that instead of managing my heart rate, I was still going for my goals of speed. In the summary, you can see that I was in the orange zone right away almost. I only spent 4% of my time in zone 3, and 17% of my time was spent in zone 5, which meant that I ended the run extremely exhausted and I couldn't do anything else that day. On day 2, I opted to start off a lot slower. I warmed up for about 10 minutes, took a short break, and then I continued on to run at about a 10-minute per mile pace. On this day, I felt for the first time that I had controlled my heart rate and that I had succeeded in implementing the program, because my breathing was controlled and I felt for the first time in running at an appreciable distance that I wasn't dying at the end. And if we take a look over here at the slope of my heart rate escalation, it's only about a 5% slope, meaning that my heart rate was pretty stable for about 30 minutes, meaning that for about 3 miles or 30 minutes of effort, I had sustainable effort. But when I look at the summary, it told a little bit different of a story. So it felt more controlled than it actually was. I spent about 22% of my time in zone 5, and there was about 72% of the time spent in the lower zones. The main difference over here was that I spent 17% in zone 3, which was the biggest amount of time that I've spent in zone 3 thus far. On day 3, December 28, I tried out different paces while trying to monitor my heart rate. I started off well enough, but if you see, I'm going to put the zone 5 line over here to show you where I crossed the line into the red zone. It started off well enough with about 5.5 minutes at a zone 3 10-minute per mile pace, and then with a small escalation of speed, I went into zone 5 at about 14 minutes. I tried out an 8.5 minute pace and tried slowing down to see if that would appreciably help my heart rate before ending the run as fast as I could. On this date, I spent too much time in zone 5. I was burnt out at the end, and with 27% of the time spent in zone 5, this was probably the hardest workout that I had in a few days. I spent a better amount of time in zone 3, but I quickly grew impatient with it. I think it was because of the music that I keep in my ears. It gets me pumped up too fast, and I want to keep going faster. So with 71% of my time in the lower zones, it was similar to previous workouts, but 27% in zone 5 was far too much for a sustainable workout. In fact, I pushed it so much on this workout that I thought to myself that I should take a rest day on day 4 so that I wouldn't, injure myself for any of the pursuing workouts. Starting on day 5, I opted to try managing my heart rate again. And after I took a day of rest, I realized that I didn't need it, or I wouldn't have needed it if I took it a little bit easier on day 3. This was a 3.9 mile day. I started off the day at a gradually increasing to a 10-minute pace, and I maintained it. I opted to stay at a slower pace most of the day, and as a reward, I stayed in the lower zones for about 25 minutes. After I came back, I wanted to finish the run a little bit stronger and get that pump from going into zone 5. And then I ended the run by forgetting to turn off my monitor. In the summary, I finally reached my goal of having less than 15% of my workout moving time in zone 5. I spent more time in zones 2 and 3, meaning that I was more patient during my run and starting off my run. And what this meant overall was that I was starting to develop this habit for a sustainable cardio, and I could have a strong run even the next day. I think one of the reasons that I was able to sustain a more stable pace was because I started participating in this program called Zwift, which is basically an electronic running trainer. It gave me a lot of running tips and helped to track and suggest paces for me, as well as tracking my data. Over here you see its ideas of my heart rate distribution, and it'll give you second by second analysis for recorded workouts. On my next day of training with Zwift, I did an interval run. Generally speaking, an interval run is not something that anybody of sanity participates on by themselves. But with this electronic run trainer, I had the motivation that I needed to get on with learning how to run faster and spending a little bit of time in higher zones with the objective of speeding up and helping my body to tolerate better lactic threshold. On New Year's Eve, I ended the year with a bang. I did my first interval training with my electronic running trainer, and I spent a significant time in zone 5, but I had an incredible return on speed from the workout. My splits for time in zone 2 and 3 were similar to days from before when I had spent more time in the lower zones, but the difference over here was what I got out of it. I started off New Year's Day with a run, starting at 10 minutes per mile, but I redlined right away, and I had to stop for a bathroom break, I realized. I spent the next 20 minutes running at 10 minutes per mile with a much more reasonable zone 4 heart rate. And then after taking another short break, I decided to try some of my own interval training. Overall, on January 1st, I did a lot better than I had expected. I felt like I was running too hard, but at 18%, zone 5 was not as much of my workout as I thought. And because I am spending more of my time in aerobic zones, I can keep up with my energy output and I'm not ending my runs feeling sore. Coming back to the dashboard that I made to track my total times over 7-day periods week by week, I made a couple gauges to track my total time for lower zones with targets for the lower zones and for zone 5. I made a red, yellow, and green gauge for zone 5 to avoid spending too much time over there. In the donut chart, I see the proportions of my time in the zones, and overall I want less time in zone 5. I ended up spending 21% of my moving time this week in zone 5. And that concludes my running analysis for week 1 of my sustainable cardio program. Thanks for watching.